Thank you for joining the Resilient Cyber Show. My name is Chris Hughes, and today I want to give a shout out to our sponsor, Wiz. Wiz transforms cloud security. It's the number one cloud security platform based on independent customer reviews that help security leaders and developers protect everything they build and run in the cloud. Leading organizations from the Fortune 100 to high growth companies all trust Wiz to innovate at the pace of the cloud while staying secure. Click the link in the show notes or head to wiz.io /lowercase rc to request a personalized product tour with a Wiz expert. Resilient Cyber podcast listeners can also get a free cloud security health scan by going to wiz.io /lowercase rc. And today I'm joined by Ross Young. Ross, thanks for being here.
Hey, thanks again for having me, Chris.
Yeah, I'm excited to chat with you. We've known each other for several years at this point. I've chatted with you, throughout various roles you've had, and I've always enjoyed our conversations. You come across as someone who's very technical. You have an interesting background, and you've had some various leadership roles too. So you always bring a great perspective. But for folks that don't know you and haven't met you yet, can you tell us a bit about your background?
Yeah, so my name's Ross Young. I started off like many folks did, got a computer science degree, and then I found this MBA program in 2005 that focused on cybersecurity at Idaho State. Went there for 2 years, and as part of my service, I decided to work for the federal government. So I did an internship at NSA, I did a year at the Federal Reserve Board, and I spent 10 and a half years at the Central Intelligence Agency. So really, really great places to go and learn and bring up your skills. And then afterwards, I spent 2 years at Capital One as a segment CISO, and I was the CISO for Caterpillar Financial for the last 4 years. And currently, I'm the CISO in residence at Team 8, which is a venture capital company that does really cool startups out of Israel.
Yeah, what makes your background so interesting to me, and I'm sure serves you well, is you have this mix of public sector, you've had, financial institutions, you've had now, startups and venture capital community. So you get a lot of unique experience and exposure. And you've put together this talk, based on your experience in different roles that you've had and how to become a CISO. Go into various topics and various aspects of how to become a CISO and certain skills you need to hone and things like that. But I'm curious, how has the talk been received so far, and what made you put this together?
What I found is it was really hard for me to find advice that was practical, right? Everybody has advice on here's how to tweak your resume. But what I really found was helpful for me was finding really good mentors that I could ask questions to, that I could bounce ideas off of. And then what I found what was really helpful was how do I just document my experience and share this with others, friends who I wanted to mentor or people I just wanted to help. And I noticed that there were like 4 phases in my career of what I had to really learn and grow. And so kudos to my partner, G. Mark Hardy, who kind of first identified these 4 phases of you have to be technical, managerial, have leadership, and then political skills. But then I actually tried to really spell out what does that look like to help grow in those skill sets.
Yeah, you mentioned Gmark, so I want to give a shout out for folks that don't know or follow your show. You have a show called CISO Tradecraft, an amazing resource. I'll plug here in the show notes in the comments as well. But really great resources from different industry leaders covering various frameworks and tons of different aspects of cybersecurity. So I want to give a shout out to that as well. But before we dive into some of the aspects you talk about in terms of becoming a CISO and the skills you need, I'm curious, like when you interact with people. Do you ever ask them the question of why do you want to be a CISO first before, here's how you do it? Do you ever kind of find yourself in the conversation of, pushing through like why you should become a CISO and what makes people want to do it? I'm curious, how that is received or how people respond.
Yeah, I think that's a really good starting point. There's a lot of people who want to be a CISO but don't really understand what the role is and don't understand how different it is. And it's just like if you were to watch movies, you would be very disenfranchised between what Harrison Ford does in any of his movies when he's, an archaeologist versus what an archaeologist does in real life, right? So if you just kind of think about those reality versus the movies, it's very different. And so for me, when I started thinking about it, what I really hated was feeling like I was in a Dilbert world. And if you've ever read the Dilbert cartoons, basically you have this really smart engineer who works for an incompetent boss, and it's really frustrating. And so there's kind of 2 things you can do in this situation. One is you can level up your skills so that you're, much better at communicating. Or the second is you can actually work to take those leadership roles and now you get to make those decisions. And so that was the thing that really got me focused on the role. Certainly, you can make more money, there's more opportunities to drive program strategies, but wanting to have that control, that authority, that autonomy was something that was very appealing. So I tell people to make sure you understand what the role is and what your why is, but that was mine.
Yeah, that makes sense. It puts you in a position to kind of drive a program, drive an organization from the security perspective, and maybe do things better than you've experienced them done in the past, or take things in a direction that you think is optimal for an organization as well. And you've broken down the four stages you talked about, in terms of technical, management, leadership, and political. And to me, that comes across as CISOs need to be a multidisciplinary, kind of multi-skill set individual. And I'm curious, why is that so important? Often people think of cybersecurity as like a technical issue, for example. Like, why is it so important to have these diverse skill sets?
So I find people are trying to jump to straight being a CISO without learning the lessons along the way that really help you succeed in the role. And I'll just kind of walk you through the different steps and what were really helpful for me. So the first thing is you need to get technical skills in one or two areas, right? So for me, it was the offensive pen testing, learning how to break into organizations. And then the second thing that I really learned about was all the cloud security and DevOps skills. And then because I had both of those things, it really allowed me to lead in areas of product security and cloud security, which were very, very influential at organizations like Capital One and others. And then the other thing that I will say is just because you're really good at being technical doesn't mean you're a good manager, right? Totally different sets of skills. So the first one, you're getting certifications like Cloud Solutions Architect or OSCP. The second one, you really need to work on your project management skills, your procurement skills, how to have one-on-one conversations, manage a budget, do the reporting. And those are things that are very, very different. And so what I would find is I was asking questions to people and I wasn't connecting in a way that I wanted to connect. And so I'll just give you a simple example. There are times when people make mistakes. And sometimes you're like, hey, why did you do that? That's kind of a bonehead move to do. And as soon as you ask a question just like that, it immediately puts somebody on the defensive because you just called them a bonehead or something else, right? And in reality, you have to just tweak those questions a little bit, and you can get the same answers just by making the questions a little more palatable. So, for example, you could say, hey, I just want to tell you what happened, and here's how people perceive you and what the result of this decision that you made was. And I'd like to just understand why it happened, right? And now you can ask the same why did you screw up question, but just by tweaking that, they can be like, oh, I didn't understand that this would have those results or I would be perceived this way. And you get the same result. So things like that I learned from Crucial Conversations, which is a really, really good book, helped me. And then it continues with the leadership skills, like how do you actually build really good strategic plans? How do you mentor employees and do all this employee retention? And then finally, the last piece of the puzzle was the political skills. And that's a whole different barn of wax, where what I would say is you really need to think like a spy and like a video game artist. And so I give the example of if you look at how FBI people recruit foreign agents, they build relationships of trust. And that's exactly what a CISO needs to be able to do. They need to build relationships of trust with the chief financial officer, with the chief legal, with all the people in the executive risk committees. And then when they want to do things to thousands of developers, they're not going to have one-on-one time to talk to that many people. So how do we take gamification as a concept and use leaderboards and all these other things that are very, very addictive and influencing behaviors from video games and apply those into our companies? So those are just some of the things. I'm happy to expound on any of those if that's helpful.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, starting with the technical aspect of, the four kind of areas you lay out here, it seems intuitive in terms of why you would need a solid technical foundation, for various reasons, right? But when I first saw this and thought about this, I imagine, these skills likely may be fluid and dynamic depending on the organization you're at. The CISO of a SaaS-based startup, right, may look significantly different from a CISO of a Fortune 500 enterprise, conglomerate of some sort. But that said, I think that technical foundation is still key. And looking at that, why do you think it's so fundamental to have that technical foundation? Because we do have CISOs and I've worked with some in different organizations or consulted, et cetera, that maybe came from more of a governance, risk and compliance, or a legal or a privacy background, or things like that. What makes this technical foundation such a critical component?
So there's a couple things. First of all, not all CISOs are created equal. There are people who are well positioned for certain roles, right? So if you grew up in incident response and worked in the SOC, that's a fantastic background to go to a company that has just had a major breach. I've never had that background. But I had the background where I did offensive security and DevOps, DevSecOps, and all the product security. So going to a company that's heavy tech and has a very internet-facing website and helping to build that out, it's key for those areas. And then if you go to the banking sector, which is heavy regulation, well, someone who has a lot of GRC experience is very, very key. So I don't want to say that GRC is not technical, right? Certainly there are things like those people who understand the laws and can almost, cite any regulation. That's amazing. So what you need to do is you need to learn those diverse skill sets so that you can have success in a role. And if you don't have that understanding, that's okay. Sometimes we don't learn it all on the job. But it doesn't mean you should limit yourself. You should read books. You should listen to podcasts. You should get smarter. Because if you don't, then you're just hurting your ability to help an organization because you don't know enough. And so, what I would say is, those people who haven't spent the time and done the due diligence don't understand enough to help the organization in a way that's helpful. So, example, if I don't know the difference between a next gen WAF and a traditional IP packet based firewall, I'm probably not going to understand why I should allocate the additional budget to buying a next gen firewall and the attacks I'm going to be able to stop with it that I couldn't stop without it. Now, if I don't understand, that may not be a limitation. Sometimes all I need to do is surround myself with smart people and enable them. However, not everybody always has that luxury. So definitely work on yourself as well as always build yourself with people smarter than you.
Yeah, I think, as you said, a few good things there. One I'm going to bring up here in a little bit, but the piece about the technical foundation, a lot of CISOs in my network and friends and things like that. One thing they have a difficult challenge with is, as you move into that CISO role, that more leadership strategic role, and you're not such in a tactical, day to day, on the grounds operational type role, it can be hard to maintain that technical foundation, right? Because you're not in the weeds on the technical topics and things like that. Throughout your career, how have you and how do you advise others kind of, maintain a strong technical foundation, given that you don't get to focus on those things quite as much and you may be a bit more, disconnected from the deep technical side of things?
So there comes a time in your career when you're not hands on keyboard running the tools. But that being said, it doesn't mean you shouldn't understand what the capabilities of the tools are. So, one of the things that I absolutely love to do, and I know people hate this, but I'll just tell you, I love it so much, is I love to go to an RSA or a Black Hat, and I love to walk around the vendor floor and meet with every single vendor. Because then I can just say, tell me, what problems do you solve? Why is this an urgent problem I need solved? And what differentiates you from every other vendor who competes with you in the same magic quadrant? Because if I know that, those three questions, then I know how this tool can help my organization. And not every tool I need, right? I don't need 20 DLP tools, but I need to understand what's the difference between, some of the major players in the DLP space in case I ever want to rebid my DLP tools in my organization. So I think that's a really, really good way, is going to these large trade shows, meeting with lots of vendors to understand what's the industry best practice. Because every 3 to 5 years, these tools evolve. Gen 1 of EDR looks very different than Gen 2. And the same could be said about GRC tools, around firewalls, and all sorts of different technologies. Every so often, there's a better mousetrap design. And are you still using the legacy approach, or is it time to update?
Yeah, you actually talked about, how another, thing to consider is you may not need to know everything, or you may not be able to know everything, obviously, right? So surrounding yourself with the right people, and this is where the management skills come into play, given if you have the luxury to build a team, and we know things like attracting and retaining technical talent can be a challenge. And then, of course, as you talked about, learning how to incentivize people and get people to work together towards a shared goal, things like that. What are some of the key management skills that you think a CISO needs to have, and, how can they go about honing those?
So I think the first thing is you need to know yourself well enough to know what your weaknesses are. And I'm just going to share a couple with the listeners here. There's things that I'm not great at. And I'll give you two examples. The first is when we get these 50-page procurement legal languages, and I have to look through those things to figure out, oh, this is just a little bit different than the norm. I'm just not good at that. And so I need someone who has that detail oriented look at these things. And then the other thing is, maybe it's the finances. Maybe you do not love looking at what our spend plan is every month. Well, if you find that those are the things that you're weak in, how do you bring someone in who has that background to complement you? Right? Maybe you bring in someone who has like this CPA accounting background and really helps on the resources side so you can focus on the strategic side. And so that's the first step, is just really knowing what you're weak at. And then the second thing that I would say is you really need to leverage your people and use them as a resource to influence the organization. And my favorite way to do this is with sticky pads or post-it notes. All you need to do is you need to give everybody 9 post-it notes and put them into a conference room. And you're going to say, okay, I want you to take your post-it notes and separate them into 3 piles of 3. And on the first one, all you're going to do is write something that we do really, really well. And so they're going to write 3 of those things that are really, really well. And then you're going to say, okay, now we're going to move on to the second group of 3. I want you to write something that appears as really, really poor, or we're not doing well enough in our organization. And then we're going to go over the third pile, and then we're going to write what's a new idea we should be trying that we haven't done yet. And now you're going to tell everybody, okay, here's a whiteboard. We're all going to post these different post-its in these 3 different columns. And now what you get to do is look for trends. And you're going to see that, hey, I read all of these things of what we're doing well. Here's the 3 things I don't need to touch because they're amazing. And then we're going to switch over to here's the things that are broken. And everybody agrees these 2 processes really suck. Well, how am I going to build that into something we're going to tackle this year to fix it for the organization? Because if you do that, your people will love you. They love, giving ideas and when you act on their feedback. And if you don't, they're going to remember that you're that worthless manager who didn't do anything to help the organization. And then last but not least is the new innovation. That's the cool things that you can really go and get these signature accomplishments to help the organization. So it doesn't cost more than just a pad of sticky notes. And I think that's just a really simple exercise to get the buy-in from people, to get, their help, and you can assign those actions out so that you're leveraging your people as well as looking at the weaknesses that you may have so that you can surround yourself with people who are going to set up the organization for success.
Yeah, one thing I like that you said there is I feel like it comes back to being self-aware in terms of knowing what you do and don't know, and also kind of that decentralized empowering of the team to let them contribute ideas and thoughts, and like as they say, good ideas over rank, for example. Let people contribute of what they know there are what problems they know of in the organization, or optimizations they want to recommend, or inefficiencies that they're aware of, and feel like they have a voice on the team, for example, which in my opinion really bleeds into the leadership aspect that you also talk about here, whether it's direct reports or the broader organization. As driving security culture can be a challenge, but it can have a massive benefit to the organization as well. So looking at the leadership side of things, what are some of the key skills over there and activities that you have in mind when you walk through the talk on leadership?
Yeah, when we switch to leadership, it's now about how do you do significant accomplishments that improve the organization. And over here, it's different. You're right. You switch from, let's say, focusing on one person to focusing on problems. You're in this leader of leader roles. You don't manage junior employees, you manage managers, right? And so here it's understanding board decks, framing executive conversations, mentorship, sponsorship, and then executing a plan. And some of these things are very, very different. And I'll just give one simple example. A lot of times I might have had a good idea that I brought to a meeting, and I shared this idea and then it got squashed. And I kept thinking to myself, I'm like, man, these guys are idiots. Why didn't they take my feedback? Like, this is a brilliant idea we needed to go with. And what I learned was, rather than complain about the people, it's how do I do a leadership role where I can be successful? And I could do the exact same thing, but I didn't do the homework. And so if you know these are the 10 people that are going to be in this meeting that you really want them to take your idea, what you do is you meet with all 10 of those people one-on-one before the meeting. You say, here's this idea I'm thinking about bringing to the next meeting. I'd love your feedback on it, and I'd love to have you help champion and support this idea when I bring it up. Is there anything I need to tweak just before I send this out? And now, when you've done that to all the people and you've done that homework before and you go into the meeting, like, they're just going to sign off. You don't even have to discuss it. You're like, oh yeah, we talked about this brilliant idea. Let's go for it. And those little things of, yeah, it's 10 times the amount of work to do all that pre-work. But if you do that, now you're not surprising anybody. They have time to process those ideas. They've actually given you some recommendations how to improve your idea, and then you're much more successful. So those are like the little leadership nuggets I had to learn in my career that were super, super helpful. When I was trying to achieve the same thing, I just didn't know how to make myself smarter in going through those approaches.
Yeah, and you're getting to things like building coalitions, getting buy-in, things like that, which and arguably, I think it, again, bleeds over to the political side of things. So last but not least, CISOs are of course are operating among C-suite peers, the board, in these complex organizations with competing interests, different personalities, different incentive structures. This could be arguably the most important skill when it comes to, driving organizational risk down and really having long-term lasting impacts on the organization. What are your thoughts and some of the key skills around the political side of things that you kind of touch on?
So on the political skills, there's really two pieces. One is the one-on-one, and one is for the masses. And when we talk about the one-on-one, this is where I mention it's how do you recruit people to your cause and build those relationships. And this is where I recommend a couple of really, really good books. Robin Dreeke has a book called It's Not All About Me, where he talks about the 10 techniques for building quick rapport with anyone. There's another one by Chris Voss where he talks about never split the difference, about how to negotiate as if your life depends on it. And these are two guys who did amazing things at the FBI. Robin Dreeke, helped recruit Russian spies. Chris Voss did terrorist negotiations when, people are trying to take over a building or something like that. And really, this is the key. At the end of the day, people will do things for their friends and help them out. And so as much as you help out the chief financial officer, the chief legal officer, all of these people in the C-suite, they'll remember that. So when you're like helping them with little things like help desk issues and just making their life better, and then you're like, hey, I have this idea I'm thinking about doing. What do you think on this? They'll remember the things that you do to go and help them, and then they'll help you. And then the other piece on the influence is what I call gamification. I think CISOs, and this is really one of the best kept secrets out there, do not use video games enough in their organization. And what I mean by that isn't I want people to play Minesweeper all day. It's that when you look at the concepts behind leaderboards, when you look at how to do different champions, how to do all of these things in video games, which companies have spent millions of dollars to figure out how to addict and how to keep people going back to these things, it's a really, really powerful concept. So there's this book called Game Frame by Aaron Dignan, who really goes into showing some of these things. And when we use these concepts, now we can influence the organization for the better. And I'll just give you one simple example of that. A lot of times, cybersecurity is like the police officer writing tickets. And everybody hates the police cops that writes them speeding tickets. Sorry for anyone who's a former law enforcement. Please don't pull me over. I like cops. But nobody likes getting a ticket, right? So what we need to do is influence and change the organization in a positive way. And I'll just give you the example of what I did when I was at Caterpillar. At Caterpillar, we used to have phishing contests every month, where once a month we would look at how many people clicked a phishing email and how many people reported it to the security team saying, this is a phish, go ahead and block it. And we used to do that by every single executive who reported to the CEO, and we used to compare them. And guess what? If you had the best phishing scores over a 3-month average, what I used to do is make a homemade brisket, bring that into the office, and celebrate you and your team. And on top of that, I went on Amazon. I found this little trophy that looks like a bass fishing trophy they'd give away at a fishing tournament. And I used to write Q3 fishing champion. And so myself or the CEO would give this away to that executive. Maybe it's HR or legal who won. And then we celebrate and we have brisket and have people come in and bring in their homemade apple pies and cobblers and sweet potatoes and everything that they make. And we would celebrate them. And guess what? People wanted that brisket. People wanted those kudos, and people wanted to be looking positive in front of their boss. So instead of me trying to beg people, hey, can I, come and share a security awareness training? They're like, hey, don't tell anybody, but I was in the bottom 2 last month, and I don't want that to happen again. How do I win? What do I need to do? And now you're being invited to that party because you're putting incentives, you're gamifying things through leaderboards, you're putting those reward structures, and you're celebrating the wins. And that's how we take cyber from being this bad cop writing tickets to being, the guy hosting the fun parties that everybody wants to get invited to. And I think that's how we do this change in security culture to be vigilant.
Yeah, I'm not going to lie. Incentives like food that people enjoy, bringing people together, having fun, laughing, building camaraderie. That gets to the cultural change that we talk about in security so often. And I think that's a great approach and really a key point for people to think about is just, building those relationships, that rapport, that trust, so that people don't dread engaging with us in security and actually want to work with us can go a long way. I want to ask you as the last question here, as someone who's held various CISO roles, and pays attention to the industry quite a bit, where do you see the future of the CISO role headed? We hear a lot about, CISOs must speak the language of the business. We have changes from the SEC. We see litigation now. We see things like, determining materiality and reporting and all these kind of things. Where do you see the CISO role headed in the future? And how do you think it'll look different from the CISO that we see now?
So I think in the future, CISOs are going to hold a lot more liability. We're very much going to be like a chief financial officer, where if we put in all of these facts and statements, they better be true. And so this means compliance is going to be a much bigger thing in the future. And so historically, we've always had this balance. How do I focus on enough risk reduction versus compliance? And we always kind of felt like these SOC 2 reports or these ISO certifications, they're like, yeah, I got to do it so I can sell to customers, but let me just do the bare minimum so that I can really focus on the risk reduction, which is stopping the phishing attacks, keeping things that are on the internet secure, worrying about identity-based attacks, and everything else that you see in the Verizon data breach report as the most likely attacks. And I think this shift is really going to be swinging back towards compliance. I just hope the laws and compliance and standards get to be something that are more MITRE attack based and less, hey, what does your test data look like in your non-prod networks? Because I think we can all agree that's not the big way where bad actors are getting into organizations, and it sucks time from the really important things. So what I mean by that, we need to invest in technologies that automate the evidence collection for compliance. We need to have conversations with our legal teams to say, what are the laws you expect me to be compliant with? Because I'm not going to follow any of the laws unless you tell me specific laws that I have to meet. Not that saying I would do anything illegal, but if you tell me I have to meet GDPR, well, I'm going to stand up a GDPR compliance program that says, here's the things we have to follow, and we're going to show evidence that we're doing every one of those things. But if you don't tell me GDPR is something I have to comply with, don't expect any of that evidence to be there, and don't expect me to sign off on any GDPR compliance, because I don't think we've done it at all unless you've given me that requirement. So that's a big focus and a change in the next year. The other thing that I would also say is all of these third-party SaaS and all of these serverless applications are changing the way we do product security. So if there is no code that we write, well, application security just looks like good identity access management. And that is something that's really hard. Yes, we can enable the single sign-on and the multi-factor authentication and conditional access control policies. But if we go back to the, hey, should Johnny be in the accounting team when he left the accounting team role 6 months ago? Probably not. And that is a very tricky thing to roll out at an enterprise level across thousands of managers to making sure we're holding them accountable for removing privileges. I think that access and identity management is going to be a much bigger thing in the future when all of a sudden your company loses data and Johnny's not even on the accounting team, but he got phished and we lost all the accounting folders. And now you got to go explain why you didn't remove access 6 months ago to those files that shouldn't have been lost. I think we're going to see that attack more and more going into the future because it just takes one box to land on. And that's so easy to do from an attacker perspective. And the liability from companies is just going to be increased because of that. So increasing identity access management issues, especially in these serverless third-party SaaS, and increased focused on compliance, I really see as the next focus for CISOs in the oncoming years.
Yeah, I won't argue with you whatsoever. There's so many layers to what you put out there in terms of, SaaS security, SaaS governance, software supply chain security, least permissive access control, and zero trust. Obviously, the increased push for things like, we talked about product security, secure by design. Obviously, things like liability and litigation. So I agree with you, and I think compliance is going to be a forcing function in the future that it predominantly hasn't been quite yet. I think that's going to continue to change in that direction. So Ross, super well said, man. There were so many avenues we could take that last answer down. But thanks for jumping on here and kind of laying out how to become a CISO, key skills to keep in mind. And for folks interested, I'll be sharing some resources from Ross in the show notes. And thanks to everyone who tuned in.
Yeah, thank you. I think there's a lot of great opportunities. Look, if you are a CISO today and really looking to improve your skills, reach out to me. We do a lot of things to help CISOs at Team 8 and have a whole village to support them. If you're looking to become a CISO, listen to podcasts like Resilient Cyber and CISO Tradecraft. A lot of really good content to up-level your game. So, Chris, thank you so much for having me on the podcast.
Anytime. Take care.